French defence. The French defence is the archetype of all openings involving pawns. Locked positions in the centre, heavy trench manoeuvres, long, hard, bitter struggles. These characterise the French. This defence has been a favourite of such players as Nimzowitsch, Bronstein, Botvinnik, Petrosian and Korchnoi. Capablanca also used it, but he often found it positionally too convoluted for his clear style of play. If you take up the French, you will not only learn a great deal about the locked pawn positions, you will also gain first-hand experience of the bad bishop, weak squares of one colour, knight outposts, the classic attack on the castled king position, and the value of delaying castling, keeping your king in the centre or castling queenside. You'll also learn quite clearly the differences between knights and bishops and their strengths in certain positions. Let us begin our survey with an example of how not to play the French defence. This was played between Greco and an amateur in Rome in 1619. The game began e4, black played e6. The French defence begins with the move e6, which releases the black queen and bishop. Black later plays d7 to d5, establishing a strong pawn in the centre of the board. At the same time, his bishop at c8 is shut in by the pawn at e6, and this bishop frequently becomes a problem piece. White's second move is pawn to d4. If he doesn't play this move, then black will tend to dominate the centre himself with moves like d7 to d5 and c7 to c5. Now after d2 to d4, black in this game played knight g8 to f6. This is black's first mistake. He brings out the knight near the centre, but the piece is exposed to attack from the white pawn at e4. However, worse is to follow. White defended his pawn with bishop f1 to d3. Black played knight to c6. White knight from g1 went to f3. Bishop f8 to e7. And now white played h2 to h4. White sees that black is following a programmed system of development. He's developing his pieces near the centre, he's moving each piece once, and now he obviously intends to castle. White's h2 to h4 is a trap, which relies on the fact that black's castling next move. Now if he didn't, then things might be different. Anyway, sure enough, black did castle. And now white played e4 to e5. Black knight f6 went to d5. Now white unleashed a variant of the famous Greek gift sacrifice, which is an attack on the castled king, which you can obtain in such positions when you have a pawn at e5, a bishop at d3 and a knight on f3. So here it goes. Bishop takes h7 check. King takes h7. Knight g5 check. Now we can see the reason for white's earlier h2 to h4. The knight is supported against capture by the bishop at e7. If black now plays his king back to g8, he is quickly mated by the white moving his queen to h5. If, on the other hand, his king goes from h7 to g6, then white also wins quite quickly. h5 check, that's pawn h5 check, king h6, then knight takes f7, discovered check, which wins the black queen. So, let's have our pieces back. The black king should be on h7, white knight on g5, white pawn on h4. Black pawn is on f7. Now, after knight g5 check, Greco's opponent decided to play bishop takes g5. White played h4 takes g5, discovered check. That was an advantage here for white in not castling. And here, if black plays king g8, the mating system white uses is quite typical. Queen to h5, threatening mate at h8. Black plays f7 to f5, giving himself an escape. And white plays g5 to g6. And now black is well and truly trapped, and white will mate on h8. Alright, let's put the black pawn back on f7, the white pawn back on g5, and the black king on h7, and the white queen on d1. So rather than go to his death with king g8, black chose to go to his death with king g6. And perhaps you would like to switch off here and discover the forced mate which white has. Checkmate in 4 moves. Well, wins are quite easy to find, but checkmates aren't that easy. I wonder if you found the sequence. Queen h5 check, king f5, queen h7 check, g6, queen h3 check, king e4, and now queen d3 checkmate. Very nice. So, if you play the French defense, remember that pawn control of the center is vital. But above all, don't be in too much of a hurry to castle. You may be simply walking into a devastating attack if you do so. Now let's look at a more successful attempt to play the line. Reset your pieces in the start position, switch off if you need to do so. White begins e4, black e6, white d4, and now black plays d7 to d5. Now white has the opportunity here to swap pawns by e4 takes d5, and black will play e6 takes d5. But this has the effect of freeing the black bishop at c8, so white rarely plays this line. Sometimes white plays his pawn from e4 to e5. And this is called the advanced variation. This move immediately locks the center, and black's usual response is to challenge the pawn at d4 by playing c7 to c5. This move serves a double purpose. Attacks the white center, offering a pawn exchange, and also allows a file to be opened for the black rooks. The black rook will later come to c8. Also the black queen can probably use the open c file. Now in order to support his center, white can play c2 to c3. And as you can see, neither side has yet developed a piece. Black now does begin to develop. He plays knight b8 to c6, and at the same time he keeps up the pressure on the pawn at d4. White plays knight to f3, black queen to b6. Same idea. Of course he's bringing out his queen early, but he is putting pressure on the d4 square, and this immediate pressure is difficult for white to cope with. White plays bishop e2, black c takes d4, white c takes d4, and now, following his plan of an attack on the d4 pawn, black plays knight to h6. The knight, of course, is not centrally placed here, but it intends to come to f5, which is a very good square, which threatens d4. And of course, if white plays bishop takes h6 here, black doesn't have to, recapture, he can actually play queen takes b2, threatening the rook at a1. Now, in order to give his pawn a bit of support, white plays the unnatural move knight b1 to a3 here, the plan being to actually bring it round to c2. This, however, gives black the opportunity to play bishop to b4 check, and unfortunately for white now he hasn't really got a good interposition. Bishop d2 will lose a pawn after knight takes d4. So white's position is under considerable strain, and he has to move king to f1 here, after which black can then keep up the pressure on the center by playing knight to f5. Now, I'd like you to return your pieces to the start position and switch off if necessary. Let's begin e4, e6, d4, d5. Now, last time we looked at the move e5, which is a straightforward way of meeting the threat from the black pawn against the white pawn at e4. However, it does have the disadvantage of giving black a ready-made plan, which we saw he was following, which was to counterattack on the static weakness at d4, with moves like c5, knight c6, queen b6. Problem with the move e5 is that it takes away white's pressure on the black pawn at d5, and this is quite a useful card that white should probably keep in his hand rather than immediately pushing on with e5. So white's more successful lines involve maintaining the pawn at e4 for the time being and only pushing it on when circumstances are more favorable. Now, one of his lines that he plays here is, instead of advancing the pawn, is playing knight b1 to c3, and that defends the pawn at e4 as well as developing a piece. Of course, black here could play pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, which is called the Rubinstein variation, and this, though, is still probably somewhat in white's favor because we can see that the bishop at c8 is still blocked by the pawn at e6. So let's return to the position after knight c3 with the white pawn at e4 and the black pawn at d5. Another method black can employ is to play his knight from g8 to f6, threatening the pawn at e4. Now, if white advances at this point to e5, black will play knight f6 to d7, and he's all ready to strike at the white center with c7 to c5. Now, when you're playing against the French defense as white, you have to be extremely careful how you defend your center. If you make a few routine developing moves, and you can be quite easily bereft of one of your pawns. I'll give you an example from this position after white goes e5 and black goes knight f6 to d7. Suppose white plays knight f3, black goes c5, white goes bishop d3. Now black can go c takes d4, white recaptures, knight takes d4, and now black can play knight takes e5. So it didn't take white long to lose that pawn. Now let's put those pieces back, and we'll play better for white. That means the white knight goes back to g1, white bishop back to f1, the white pawns on e4 and d4. Black pawn on c7, black knight on f6. So white needs to follow his plan of developing pieces, but keep an eye, a very careful eye on his center. So a better move than playing e5 is to go bishop c1 to g5. Black plays bishop to e7, and this is to break the pin. White can now go e5, knight f d7, white bishop takes e7, black queen takes e7. So we get a similar position to our last example, but there is a vital difference. The black squared bishops for both sides have been swapped off, and black has been left weak on the dark squares. and he has both his centre pawns, the one on e6 and d5, and his bishop. They're all fixed on the white squares. So black is really weak on black squares, but too strong on the white squares, over strong. And his bishop, of course, is suffering from lack of mobility. Now we'll follow this line through, which is called the classical variation, and see why it's not so popular nowadays for black. White still needs to exercise a lot of care with his centre, and so we'll see him playing first queen d2, black castles, white plays f4, black c5, white knight f3, black knight c6. And now Rubinstein's move g3 here. Black continues his assault on the white centre by playing f6. And here white plays e takes f6, queen takes f6, pawn takes on c5, knight takes on c5, and white here castles queenside. Now here white has allowed the centre pawns to be exchanged off, but he still retains his advantage, as the bishop at c8 is blocked in by the pawn at e6, and the squares d4 and e5, which are both black squares, are not very well controlled by black. Certainly they can never be defended by pawns. White will play by moving his bishop to g2 and his rook from h1 to e1, putting pressure along the central lines against the black centre. Now let's return to the start position again. Switch off if you need to while you're doing so. Let's play again e4, e6, d4, d5, white knight to c3. Right, since the classical variation knight to f6 leads to a poor game for black, the more modern Winava variation, which involves the move bishop f8 to b4, has become more popular. Black usually swaps his bishop for the knight at c3 and doubles the white pawns. At first, the move bishop to b4 was regarded as a positional blunder, as black seemed to be voluntarily parting with his good bishop and allowing white the advantage of the two bishops. Well, let's look at this more closely. After knight c3, black plays bishop b4. This again has a threat of winning a pawn by pawn takes e4. So white pushes on here e5, and black counterattacks in the centre with pawn to c5. White plays a3, black bishop takes c3 check, white pawn takes on c3. Botvinnik was one of the first players to realize that the blocked position in the centre might actually favour the short-hopping knights than the bishops, and this is one of the reasons that actually black does quite well in the Winava variation. We'll look at one of Botvinnik's games against Smyslov, where he followed the policy of trench warfare. Black here played knight e7. White went pawn to a4, that's to allow his bishop to come out to a3. Black played knight b8 to c6. White knight to f3. Black queen went to a5, threatening the pawn at c3. And white went bishop d2. Probably queen d2 is a bit better, so his bishop can come out to a3. Now black sealed the position with pawn to c4. White sought activity on the king side, knight g5, pawn to h6, knight back to h3, black knight to g6, white queen to f3, black bishop to d7, white knight to f4, black took, and white recaptured with the queen. So white's still trying to make some progress on the kingside. Black played now his knight back to e7. You can see in this very locked position you can take time to make these long-winded maneuvers because the opponent cannot really get at you that quickly. So after knight e7, white played h4, and black rather cheekily played bishop takes a4, winning a pawn, and later on black unravelled his pieces and won the game. Now this Winava variation faces white with one of his toughest challenges to e4, and therefore many players have ducked this opening by choosing to play the Tarrasch variation instead. So please reset your pieces in the start position, switch off if you need to. Play the moves e4, e6, d4, d5. Now, as we've seen, if white plays knight c3, black can meet this with bishop to b4, which leads to the very tough lines of the Winava. Instead of that, an alternative move which is very popular is to play knight to d2. This is a favourite move of Karpov's, and he's had a great deal of success with it. Now, one of the main advantages of this move is that the Winava variation is impossible. If black plays bishop to b4 here, white will simply drive the bishop away with pawn to c3. Therefore, black has to look for counterplay in other ways. Now, black has 2 or 3 lines here. He could play knight c6, attacking the white pawn at d4, and then trying later to break open the center with e5. That's called the Guimard variation. He can also play the move knight to f6, and then we get a variation such as e5. Black knight goes to d7. Now white plays bishop to d3. Black plays pawn to c5. White plays pawn to c3. And this is similar to the positions we've seen in the classical variation after white went e5 and knight d7. Now the difference is that black still retains his bishop at f8, his black squared bishop, so he has got better chances in this line than he has in the classical variation. For white too, with his knight on d2, he is able to actually defend his pawn at d4. He can play pawn to c3, and then if black captures on d4, white can recapture with the pawn. So again, though this knight d2 harms white's development to a degree, as we've seen so often in these introductory discussions of the openings, in many cases pawn control of the center is of greater significance than the mere development of the pieces. We'll follow this line a little further to see what sort of position can arise. Now, after c7 to c5 and white plays c2 to c3, black plays knight to c6, knight b8 to c6, and white plays knight g1 to e2. He could put the knight on f3, but as he's intent on defending his d4 point, he'll want to move his other knight, the one on d2, to f3. So you can't put 2 knights on the same square. That's why he's played knight e2. Black now plays queen b6, threatening the d4 point. Of course, at any point in this game, white could play pawn takes pawn on c5, but the effect of that will be to weaken his defense of his pawn at e5. So the whole thing is to try and maintain this chain of pawns. Now after queen b6, white plays knight to f3. Black takes on d4, pawn takes d4, white pawn takes d4. Black now continues his attack on the center, pawn to f6. White pawn takes f6. Black knight takes f6. White castles, and black plays bishop to d6. White rook to e1, and black now castles kingside. And here white sometimes plays knight to f4. This is one of the ancient lines of the Tarrasch variation, with white threatening to capture the pawn at e6, but black having many tactical counter chances at his disposal. Note though that black cannot win the white pawn at d4 at the moment. If he plays knight takes d4, white knight takes d4, black queen takes d4, white will win his queen by playing bishop takes h7 check, and then queen takes queen. Right, let's reset the pieces again. Still looking at the Tarrasch variation after e4, e6, d4, d5, white knight to d2, which of course guards the pawn at e4 without allowing the Winava variation. Black can choose a totally different variation here. Instead of playing knight f6, he can play c7 to c5. And the thing about these positions are that you get very open positions in the center, very unlike the normal French defense. White here plays pawn takes d5, black e6 takes d5. Now, normally white doesn't make this exchange pawn takes d5 because it frees the black bishop at c8. The reason he's doing it here is that later he's going to capture the pawn at c5 and thus isolate the black pawn at d5. This pawn has no pawns by the side of it, and therefore it has to be defended by black's own pieces. Now, black's accepted this positional weakness because in exchange he has got very free play for his pieces. His bishop at c8, as I said, isn't locked in, and all his other pieces get good posts, so he thinks it's worth putting up with this small pawn weakness. Now we'll follow the game Botvinnik against Boleslavsky, played in the Absolute Championship of Russia, which occurred in 1941. This was won very convincingly by Botvinnik. Now, white now played bishop b5 check. Black played knight to c6. White's knight from g1 went to f3, and black played bishop to d6. Black has to be careful not to play his development too automatically. If he plays something like knight f6 and then moves his bishop out to d6, white will quickly castle and play rook e1 check, and black will be in some difficulties about how to oppose the rook along the center line. So by playing his bishop to d6, as he's done here, he may be able to bring his knight to e7, which will block the center line and also give his knight at c6 some support. So bishop d6. Now white played pawn takes pawn. White has waited to make this capture until black has actually moved his f8 bishop, and in this way white, as it were, gains the tempo, because if he'd have played pawn takes pawn straight away, black could have captured the pawn in one move, whereas in fact black has played his bishop, moved his bishop to d6, and now he has to move it again. So black plays here bishop takes c5. White now castles, and black plays knight e7. As I mentioned, that is in order to block the e file. If he played knight f6, then he might have to put his bishop back on e7, which is a more passive spot than where it actually ends up. So knight e7, white now plays knight b3, and the black bishop drops back to b6, where it's much more active than it otherwise would be. White here chose to play a surprising move, bishop to e3. Now Botvinnik's plan here is not simply to weaken or attack the weakness at d5. He also wants to gain control of the black squares. So if he can if he can settle a knight on c5 or d4 at some point, then he's going to get a good grip on the centre. So we're still seeing that there are some elements of anti-French strategy in Botvinnik's game, because we know against the French one often as white plays on the black squares. The game here continued with, after bishop to e3, black played bishop takes bishop, white played pawn takes bishop. According to Botvinnik, he should have captured bishop takes knight check first. Black castled, white played queen d2, black queen to b6, a4, black bishop to f5, knight from f3 to d4, knight takes d4, white played pawn takes d4, and this position gave white some advantage because his knight was able to occupy c5, and also the black bishop was slightly immobilized due to the pawn at d5. Now I've done a very quick analysis of the main variations of the French defense: the classical, the advanced, the Renava and the Tarrasch. If you want to find out more, then there are several tapes in the audio chess series. There's the ones by Talbot on the McCutcheon and the Renava and the Advance, and there's also one by Plaskett on the Tarrasch, and there's a full French defense repertoire, up-to-date repertoire from Andrew Martin, which gives different systems and ideas to those outlined in the earlier tapes which I've mentioned.